Last time we'd been talking about different storages and we talked about sensory memory and we talked about short-term memory or working memory. And then by the end of it, we touched on or we talked about how there is a long-term memory, but we didn't really get to what exactly the long-term memory is about. So basically what the long-term memory storage is that it is understood to be a storage of unlimited capacity, right? Which can store different memories for an extended period of time. Now, evidence for long-term memory comes from this idea of flashbulb memories. Now, I'm not sure if you guys have heard about this idea before, but flashbulb memories are memories. So, for example, if I ask you this question that where were you or what were you doing when you heard about or you felt the 2008 earthquake? Or, similarly, where were you when you heard about the APS attack, right? So chances are that you will have a very vivid recollection of where you were, what were you doing, right? So these are basically, this kind of memory is called flashbulb memory. And this is seen as evidence that there is a long-term storage, that even though these events happened, several years ago, but you still remember everything so vividly, right? So it shows that, these memories have survived over an extended period of time, and there might be many such memories that you hold in your long-term storage, and therefore we say that it has unlimited capacity, right? So this is basically it for the different kinds of storages. Now, when we talked about different kinds of processes with regards to memory, so we talked about encoding, we talked about storage, and now we come to the last process, which is that of retrieval, right? When we talk about retrieval, one of the first things that we look at is that sometimes we have a lot of problems in retrieving data. So they might have been encoded, but we're unable to retrieve them. And this is best sort of illustrated by what we call the tip of the tongue phenomena. Now, I don't know how many of you are familiar with what exactly the tip of the tongue phenomena is, but it's basically when, you see someone and you know their name, but it just doesn't come to you. Like you're trying very, very hard, but you know it that you know it. And it's right at the tip of your tongue, but you're just not able to say it, right? So that's what is called the tip of the tongue phenomena, right? And usually what you find is that once you stop thinking about it, it usually comes very naturally to you, right? So this basically is because of a failure to retrieve information. You have stored that information, but it's basically a failure with regards to retrieval, right? This may lead us to a question, which is that how may we aid retrieval, right? So one of the ways that you can aid retrieval is through reinstating the context, right, in which you made the memory or in which you created the memory code, right? So if you reinstate the context, right, that really helps. So, one of the things that you might have noticed when you watch all of these crime movies is that whenever you're questioning an eyewitness about a crime, you try to reinstate the context. You try to say that, so what exactly, you try to ask certain questions that, what sort of day was it? What were you wearing? Who all was present at the crime scene, right? So what are you trying to do in that scenario? You're trying to reinstate the context. And, this phenomena is best illustrated. So for example, you're doing some work and in order to finish that particular work, you need a pair of scissors and you walk into the next room and your intention was to get that pair of scissors. But when you walk into that room, you're like, oh, why was I here? Why did I come here? And what you do is that you go back to the room in which you were working. And when you go back to that context, you again remember that, it was the scissors that you had gone for, right? So reinstating context always really helps with retrieval. However, at certain times we can make grave mistakes during the process of retrieval, right? Especially when we have something that we call the misinformation effect. Now, let me show you what this is. So basically, this was an experiment, right, done by this researcher by the name of Elizabeth Loftus, right? And let me show you this diagram that will help you understand. Basically, in this experiment, what you did was that you had participants watch a video of two cars getting into an accident, right? So basically hitting each other, right? But then what you did was that you used different kind of words with different participants. So, for example, with this group of participants, right? What you did was that you said that the cars hit each other, right? These are the words you used to describe the video that they were watching, right? Whereas for another group of participants, you said that the cars smashed into each other, right? Now, this is basically just using different words to describe the same types of phenomena, right? But, a week later, when you asked, these participants, they saw any broken glass, right? When there was actually no broken glass in the actual videos, right? So for the participants for whom you had described the video and said that these cars hit each other, only 14% of them said yes, there was broken glass, right? When they in the actual video there was no broken glass. But for the group of participants for whom you described the video as two cars smashing into one another, 32% of them said yes, that they saw broken glass, which is, almost double. It's actually more than double the amount of the participants here, right? So, the sort of words that, you use to ask a question. So this is the question that you ask these participants, which is about how fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other. Whereas here you say they hit each other, right? So, even the words that you use when you're trying to recall a memory or retrieve a memory, that has such a powerful effect in what you remember, right? So here, these participants ended up remembering broken glass, which wasn't even present in the actual video. This is basically something that's called the misinformation effect, that the information that you receive after having witnessed a particular event, right, that can have an impact on how you remember a particular event, right? So this is basically what the misinformation effect is. Basically is that you have certain post-event information which is misleading, right? And what that does is that it leads you to remember, differently, remember the event differently. So this is basically what the misinformation effect is, right? And this experiment here is an illustration of this effect. Then there are other problems in retrieval as well. So some of these are what are called source monitoring, and sorry for the spelling. So source monitoring, right? And you also have reality monitoring. So a source monitoring error occurs when you misattribute a particular, sort of memory to an incorrect source, right? So this is when you have, you mistakenly attribute a memory to a wrong source. So, let's, for example, say that you read something on Facebook, right? You read a particular article on Facebook about mental health, right? But you mistakenly think that you read this piece of information, right, which you actually read on Facebook. You mistakenly believe that you read it inside your Psych 100 textbook, right? So this is basically a source monitoring error that you mistakenly attributed this memory that you have, which is, an article that you read, to the wrong source. So you originally read it on Facebook, but you mistakenly thought that you read it in your Psych 100 textbook. So this is what we call a source monitoring error, right? On the other hand, reality monitoring is basically when you try to think about whether, something actually happened or whether you only thought that it happened, right? So it's basically you thinking about, you know, how real this particular memory is, right? So you're pondering over whether something happened or you thought it happened, right? So, for example, this really applies to me because most of the times, right, I need to take these medicines in the morning and I can never remember whether I actually took the medicine, right? Or whether I only think I took the medicine versus whether I only intended to take it, right? So this is a dilemma that happens very often, and when you're trying to decide this, you're engaging in what is called reality monitoring. So in reality monitoring, what you're trying to decide is whether your memories, right, are based on external events that actually happened in the world, right, in the external world, or are they based only on internal thoughts and imagination, right? That's the decision that you're trying to make when you're indulging in reality monitoring, right? So this is basically it about retrieval. Next, we come to another very important topic, which is that of forgetting. Now, basically, when we study forgetting, one of the first people that we look at when we look at, forgetting is this person by the name of Ebbinghaus, right? Because Ebbinghaus, what he did was that he tried to study forgetting and how quickly we forget. That's basically what he was trying to look at, right? And one of the first things that he did was that he created these lists of nonsense syllables, which basically means that he created these lists of syllables that did not mean anything, right? What can be an example of this? So, for example, something like tur, right? This is a nonsense syllable because it doesn't mean anything, right? Or, for example, mup, right? So these are all nonsense syllables, right? They're basically, they look like words, but they don't mean anything, right? And what he did was that he memorized them himself, right? And he looked at the time that it took for him to forget them, right? And what he, got out of doing this is that he created what is called Ebbinghaus's forgetting curve, right? Let me show you what that looks like. And as basically, so what we have here is here we're looking at time on the x-axis, right? On the y-axis, we're looking at retention, so how much material is retained or it's held in memory. So, we can study forgetting or we can study the opposite, right? The opposite of that, which is retention, all right? So what we see here is that, a lot of material. So here you have 100% retention, but then what you see is that there's a very quick drop, right? And this very quick drop is within the first 20 minutes of having learned this material. So basically, within the first 20 minutes of you learning something, you're forgetting it, right? This applies not obviously to all material, but very specifically to, Ebbinghouse's, you know, this is basically his curve for nonsense syllables. So it applies mostly to nonsense syllables, right? And what you have here is that, most learning, so almost, something like more than 50% of it is lost within the first hour of having learned it, right? And then within 99 hours, right, only, slightly more than 30% is retained. And then the curve sort of becomes more stable. So most learning is what we get by Ebbinghaus's forgetting curve is that whatever you learn, most of it is gone within the first day of having learned it, right? This is what you get out of this curve. Talk about forgetting, and when I say that, in order to study forgetting, you can also study retention, right? This brings us to the next point, which is how do you measure forgetting, right? So you can either measure forgetting or you can measure retention. It's really, two sides of the same coin in some way, right? So when we look at measures of forgetting, right? What we see is that we have three kinds of measures, right? The first of these is, and we're basically, so we're not trying to measure forgetting here, but we're trying to measure retention. So we're trying to measure how much of material is retained, right? Or it's held within memory. And the ways that you can measure retention, the first of these is through recall, right? The second of these is recognition, right? And the third of these is relearning. Now, what exactly are these? So, for example, if I ask you this question, what is the capital of India, right? Now, this is a recall measure of retention because it basically what it requires of you is that you recall certain information, right? On the other hand, if I give you a question which basically looks like this, it looks like this. What is the capital of China, right? And I give you certain options, right? So the first option is something like Beijing. The other option is Shanghai, right? And the third option is Hong Kong, right? Now, basically, what this sort of question requires is for you to recognize one of these options as being the correct option. And I believe this is the correct option. So this is what we call a recognition measure of retention. It basically, what it requires is that you recognize the correct answer from, a particular choice or a particular group of options that you have, right? So basically, for a recall measure retention, you have to reproduce the material yourself, and there are no cues to help you reproduce it. Whereas in recognition, the right answer is right there in front of you, and you just need to recognize it, right? So this is the difference between a recall measure and a recognition measure, right? So MCQs are recognition measures of retention. What exactly would be a relearning measure of retention then? So basically, a relearning measure of retention, what it does is that you're required to learn material a first time and then a second time, and what you see is that when you learn it a number of times, then how many more times do you need to go over the material again in order to retain it? Right? Or for example, if you learn it a second time, how much better are you able to remember than when you learned it only one time. So that is basically what a relearning measure of retention is, right? So these are the three different measures of retention that we have. What you find is that mostly recognition kinds of measures are best at checking for retention. This is what you see here, that in a variation of the original experiment, right, that we saw earlier, which was conducted by Ebbinghaus, you had these researchers, what they did was they had subjects, they had participants learn a list of nonsense syllables, and then they either tested them through recognition measures of retention or recall measures. And what you see is that the retention, when you use a recognition task, was much better, right? As compared to a recall task, right? So the forgetting curve for the recall is much steeper. This is what you can see here, as compared to the one that calls for recognition, right? So basically, recognition yields much higher estimates of retention. Okay, so next we come to the very important question, which is basically, why do we forget? Right? So the answer to this question is there's no one answer, right? There are many different factors. One of the first is ineffective coding, and that's what we talked about earlier in the beginning of the chapter as well. That if, for example, you are not paying attention, so you're not forming an appropriate memory code. And if you're not able to form an appropriate memory code, then you will obviously end up forgetting the information. So if you do not pay attention during a lecture, you will not be able to remember it, right? So this is one of the first factors that are involved in answering this question, that why do we forget? The next factor is that of decay, right? Which is basically, what that means is that with the passage of time, memories tend to become rusty, right? And they tend to decay, right? Basically, what happens is that with the passage of time, right, memory traces, they begin to fade, right? So this is basically what decay theory holds, right? Then the next factor that we have is that of interference. Now, what exactly is interference? So the theory of interference holds that you tend to forget certain material, right? Because there is competition from other material. Now, what could be examples of this? And when we talk about interference, what we see is that there are two different kinds of interference. So one of these kinds of interference is called retroactive interference, right? Which is basically that you are trying to learn something new, right? And that new learning is interfering with the old learning, right? Now, let's suppose that you have studied economics, right? And then after that, you decide to study psychology, right? And then the next morning you have an economics test. But what happens is that you're studying psychology, which is, the newer learning, right, is interfering with the older learning, right? So basically, what is happening is that because you studied psychology, your recall of previously learned material is affected. So your recall, when you appear for this test, your recall for the economics material, right, will be affected or will be reduced, right? Because after studying economics, you decided to study psychology, right? So new material interferes with the retention of older material, right? So that is what is retroactive interference, right? What exactly is proactive interference, which is, the other kind of interference that we look at, that is basically that you studied psychology, and after that you studied economics, and you had an economics test, right? So this is basically proactive interference, that older learning interferes with new learning, right? Because you had studied psychology earlier, you're not able to retain much of what you're studying of economics, right? So this again would hamper your retention on the economics test because of what you had studied earlier, right? So this is basically that older learning is interfering with new learning, right? So again, here recall for the econ material is reduced, right? Because, of whatever you had learned earlier. One of the things that we see is that when we talk about interference, right, what we see is that because, in interference, there is competition from other material, right? When we say that there's competition from other material, how similar the material is to whatever it is that we are learning afterwards or what we had learned previously, right? That also plays a part in terms of how much interference happens, right? So let me show you a diagram which will help you understand this better. What you see here is that, these researchers, what they did was that they had these participants learn some words, right? And what they did was that after, having learned these words, they gave them certain synonyms, right, of the same words, right? And what you see is that synonyms, when they had synonyms, their retention, right, or their recall for the test items is the lowest because with synonyms, they are very, very similar to the words that these participants were exposed to. So here, similarity is maximum, and when similarity is maximum, then recall is really affected because interference is maximum, right? When they were given no sort of stimulus, the retention was the highest. When they were given numbers, which are obviously very distinct from words, their recall was higher, right? When they were given antonyms, their recall was higher than when they were given synonyms, right? So that shows that, when material is very, very similar, right, that causes greater interference, right? Clarity really plays a major part in how interference happens. Then another factor that is implicated in why we forget is that of retrieval failure, right? So basically, you've encoded properly, it's been stored, but you're not able to retrieve it. And most of the times, this is because the retrieval queue, right, what you're using to retrieve this information, it does not match the memory code, right? So when there is this kind of scenario that the queue that you're using in order to retrieve this particular memory does not match the memory code, then you have what is called retrieval failure, right? Then you have another factor which is implicated in why we forget, and that is basically what we call motivated forgetting. Now, motivated forgetting is basically when you do not wish to remember a particular memory, or if it causes you pain or it causes you anxiety, right? So you might repress this memory, this particular memory, and you might forget it. So this phenomena is understood as motivated forgetting, that whatever causes you a lot of stress or anxiety, you choose to forget that part of your life or that particular memory, right? So this is something that's called motivated forgetting. And these are all of the different factors that are implicated in why we forget.